In the heart of Washington, D.C., a scandal that no one could have predicted erupted. A federal judge known for his steadfastness faced the indomitable power of a young politician, Karoline Leavitt. What started as a small fine turned into a massive legal earthquake worth $800 million. But as the truth began to surface and public pressure grew by the hour, the judge did something that shocked the entire country. Find out exactly what happened in this stunning story. Enjoy the story. In the heart of Washington, D.C., where political tensions simmer as much as they seethe under the city's polished veneer, an event unfolded that would soon dominate national headlines. The austere marble corridors of the federal courthouse had seen many high-profile cases, but none quite like the one about to take place. A case that would pit the cherished values of religious freedom against the rigid dictates of courtroom decorum. At the center of this maelstrom was Karoline Leavitt, the young, tough and principled White House press secretary, known for standing up for the rights of the underrepresented and for unwaveringly championing the freedom to practice one's faith. Karoline had always carried herself with a distinctive blend of professional poise and personal conviction. She was a familiar figure on the national stage, calm yet assertive, eloquent yet unyielding, dressed sharply as always. She walked into the courthouse that fateful morning with a noticeable accessory that had become somewhat of her trademark, a small but striking cross necklace, a symbol of her religious convictions and a quiet assertion of her faith. For Karoline, this cross was not merely an ornament. It represented a piece of her identity, a constant reminder of the very freedoms she was determined to protect. However, on this day, that same symbol of faith would become the catalyst for an explosive controversy. As the courtroom filled with a mixture of government officials, legal experts, and a swarm of media representatives eager for a headline-grabbing moment, the atmosphere was charged with an anticipated tension. At the bench sat Judge Charles Hargrove, a man whose reputation for strictly enforcing courtroom decorum was matched only by his controversial and sometimes overzealous interpretations of neutrality. Known for his uncompromising approach, Judge Hargrove had a habit of meting out swift, if harsh, punishments when the rules were perceived to be bent, even in subtle symbolic ways. The proceedings began on a brisk note, as Karoline took her place among the other litigants for what was billed as a hearing on religious freedom, a case that was ostensibly designed to protect the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution. Yet the session quickly took a dramatic turn. With a few succinct words that would be remembered for their bitter sting, Judge Hargrove publicly singled out Karoline for a perceived violation of courtroom neutrality. "Ms. Leavitt," he pronounced in a tone that reverberated off the impressive wood-paneled walls, "it appears that you have allowed your personal beliefs to cloud the decorum required in this sacred hall of justice." His target was unmistakable. All eyes shifted to Karoline as he continued. "For the blatant display of religious symbols, namely the cross adorning your neck, you have contravened the tenets of neutrality expected in this establishment. I hereby impose a fine of $500 for your egregious breach." A collective gasp arose within the courtroom. The accusation struck at the very heart of Karoline's identity. While many in the courtroom knew that the law protected the right to express one's religious beliefs, Judge Hargrove's interpretation, the focus on maintaining an appearance of neutrality, was both unexpected and disturbingly authoritarian. The simple act of wearing a cross, a gesture of deep personal significance, was now framed as a provocative act, one with potential political implications. Within moments, the entire scene burst into a frenzy of activity. Reporters in the gallery furiously scribbled notes, while cameras zoomed in on Karoline's composed yet noticeably strained expression. The judge's remarks, delivered with the conviction of a man defending a contrived standard, were being recorded and later broadcast in detailed highlight reels. Headlines emerged almost instantaneously. Judge Hargrove fines WH Press Secretary for religious display and faith or provocation, the cross that sparked controversy in court. Across social media platforms, opinions clashed like titans. Some commentators decried Judge Hargrove's ruling as an affront to religious liberty, decrying the fine as a blatant infringement on the constitutional right to worship openly and proudly. Tweets and posts raged as ordinary Americans and some political figures rallied to her defense. In contrast, other voices, often from partisan corners, accused Karoline of using her public position to intentionally provoke controversy. Critics argued that her choice to wear the cross was a calculated political statement meant to stir debate and spotlight her personal ideology in a manner that was wholly inappropriate for a mediator of state affairs. As the media frenzy intensified, the political ramifications became increasingly evident. Major television networks interrupted their primetime broadcasts to cover the unfolding spectacle, and countless online news outlets aggregated the day's dramatic developments. Political pundits debated the case on live panels, weighing in on whether Judge Hargrove's decision was a necessary enforcement of decorum or a symptom of an overzealous judiciary interfering in the rights of public officials. Within the hallowed halls of Washington's power brokers, heated discussions ensued about the balance between personal religious expression and the impartiality expected of government representatives. Throughout it all, Karoline maintained a dignified silence. Though visibly hurt by the public humiliation and the implication that her personal beliefs were somehow inappropriate, she remained steadfast. Her students of integrity were not cowed by a momentary lapse in justice. Instead, the incident galvanized her resolve, setting the stage for an unprecedented legal confrontation, a battle for not only her personal vindication, but also a broader defense of religious freedom. Little did anyone know that this single courtroom episode would serve as the opening salvo in a much larger, national legal drama. In the weeks and months that would follow, what began as a fine and a humiliating public reprimand would escalate into an $800 million lawsuit, spearheaded by Karoline Leavitt herself, a lawsuit designed to hold the judiciary accountable for overstepping its bounds and to ensure that freedom of religious expression was upheld as a sacrosanct right. In the wake of the humiliating courtroom debacle, Karoline Leavitt refused to allow the unjust fine and the public snub to tarnish her spirit. Instead, with resolute fury and an unwavering commitment to defend her fundamental rights, she marshaled her inner strength and transformed personal insult into a clarion call for justice. That very afternoon, in a packed conference room in downtown Washington, Karoline called for an urgent press conference, one that would soon send shockwaves throughout the nation. The room was already abuzz with chatter from reporters eager for a glimpse of the determined press secretary, whose dignity had been callously besmirched. As soon as the lights brightened and the cameras began to roll, Karoline strode confidently to the podium. Gone was the quiet manner of a devoted civil servant. In its place stood a woman whose features were set in fierce resolve and whose eyes blazed with righteous indignation. With a voice that resonated with both the power of conviction and the steady cadence of someone who'd weathered storms before, she began, "Today, I stand before you, not only as a White House press secretary, but as a defender of the very liberties that form the bedrock of our nation." Her opening words rippled through the room, silencing even the most boisterous of background conversations. "I have been subjected to public humiliation for simply wearing a symbol of my faith, a cross that I wear faithfully as a testament to who I am. Judge Charles Hargrove's decision to fine me a mere $500 for displaying my religious devotion is not only a travesty of the principles of neutrality, but an overt act of discrimination. This is an affront to the First Amendment and to the values of religious freedom that every American is entitled to enjoy." Karoline's tone was unrelenting, and as she continued to speak, it was clear that her words came not from a place of mere personal hurt, but were deeply rooted in her observation of a much larger injustice. "I have always believed that the walls of our government and our courts are meant to protect the freedoms of all, regardless of one's personal beliefs. Yet today, those very institutions have demonstrated a bias that chills the voices of those who dare to stand for what they believe in. The actions of Judge Hargrove and the systemic support provided by this county's judicial powers have not only violated my constitutional rights, they have compromised the faith of an entire community in the system of justice." As she spoke, Karoline referenced a meticulously prepared statement and a robust dossier of evidence that documented the incident, along with several similar cases where the judge's actions had skewed uncomfortably close to outright prejudice. With measured precision, she detailed how the judging officer had publicly humiliated her, using words that belittled her for her religious expression and attempting to deflect attention from the very freedoms that she was sworn to protect. The fine, insignificant in monetary terms, is emblematic of a broader malaise, a dangerous precedent that allows those in positions of authority to wield their power arbitrarily and without accountability, she proclaimed. In a dramatic crescendo that captivated everyone present, Karoline announced, "Effective immediately, I am filing a lawsuit of no less than $800 million against Judge Hargrove and the entire judicial system of this county. This lawsuit is not merely about a $500 fine, it is a stand against institutional discrimination, an assault on the sacrosanct principles of our Constitution, and an assertion that even those who hold power are not above the law." The declaration, sharp and decisive, was met by a mixture of gasps and fervent applause from members of the press and supporters in the audience. Cameras zoomed in on her as she laid out the legal and moral rationale behind her staggering claim. She spoke of the First Amendment, a cornerstone of American democracy, asserting that every citizen, regardless of their faith, must be permitted to display symbols of personal devotion without fear of retribution from a biased judiciary. Her words struck a chord nationwide. Within minutes of her announcement, major news outlets began broadcasting live segments. Political commentaries flared up. Republican pundits hailed her courage as a bold stand for freedom, while some Democratic figures stressed that the lawsuit might force a long-overdue reckoning within a system that too often protected its own. In the midst of this media maelstrom, Karoline maintained her characteristic composure. Yet behind her steely gaze, there was a glimmer of empathy for every citizen who believed that the judicial system should serve as a protector of rights, rather than a weapon against dissent. "I do not seek this lawsuit for revenge," she continued. "I do it to reclaim the dignity of every person who has ever been silenced by an overzealous authority. I do it because the law must be applied equally and fairly, and when it is not, the consequences echo far beyond the confines of any single courtroom." Her statement also touched on the personal toll this miscarriage of justice had inflicted upon her. For too long, she revealed with a controlled pause, "I have lived in a world where an innocuous expression of faith could be twisted into an act of provocation. Today, I choose to reclaim the narrative. I choose to remind our judicial system and our nation that no one, regardless of how influential they claim to be, can dictate the terms on which we live our truth." The press conference lasted over an hour, as Karoline fielded questions with poise, expounding on the legal grounds for her claim and the broader implications for civil liberties in America. Legal analysts in the room commented on the far-reaching impact of her challenge against a judicial authority that had charged a person for merely showcasing her faith. Her articulate, methodically reasoned responses left little doubt that this lawsuit was destined to be one of the most consequential legal battles in recent memory, one that would force a national conversation about the intersection of personal liberty, state power, and the sanctity of religious expression. As the crowd finally began to disperse, the air was thick with a sense of imminent change. Karoline Leavitt had not only redefined her personal response to disgrace, but had also set in motion a legal and cultural confrontation that would soon reverberate across the halls of power in Washington and beyond. With her head held high and her resolve unshaken, she sent a clear message: when the very institutions meant to safeguard justice become instruments of discrimination, the fight for truth and equality must be waged loudly, decisively, and without compromise. Within hours of Karoline Leavitt's landmark announcement and the firestorm that followed, the story exploded into a full-blown national scandal. Across Washington, D.C., and beyond, televised news broadcasts, online outlets, and social media platforms erupted with discussions about the unprecedented lawsuit. The headline, White House Press Secretary Sues Judge for $800 million over religious discrimination, splashed across every major news channel, igniting fierce debates about freedom of expression, judicial bias, and the very nature of authority in America. Inside the courtroom system, a palpable climate of panic quickly took hold. Colleagues and fellow judges, previously unafraid to enforce the strict rules of decorum, began to distance themselves from Judge Charles Hargrove. Rumors spread behind closed doors as senior legal officials expressed concern over the public relations disaster that now threatened to undermine the perceived impartiality of the judiciary. One anonymous insider confided in a leading news outlet, "Judges are terrified that any association with Judge Hargrove will reflect badly on their own records. His decision has opened a Pandora's box of questions about neutrality and accountability in our court system." This chilling domino effect within the judiciary underscored a growing fear that the scandal could ripple through the entire legal establishment. In Washington's political corridors, the fallout was equally explosive. Among Republicans, Karoline quickly emerged as a symbol of resistance, a brave warrior standing up against an overreaching, biased system. Prominent Republican lawmakers and media pundits praised her for turning a personal episode of humiliation into a clarion call for reform. "Karoline is fighting for the very essence of religious freedom," declared one influential senator during a televised debate, "and her courage in demanding accountability is exactly what this country needs." Her message resonated strongly with conservative constituents, who saw in her lawsuit a challenge to what they perceived as the growing conformity and elitism embedded in federal institutions. Conversely, Democratic leaders found themselves walking a tightrope. While many sympathized with the principle that no one should be above scrutiny, they were cautious about endorsing a lawsuit that could be misconstrued as overly partisan. Several Democratic strategists called for an objective review of the case, emphasizing the need for unity and cautioning against further polarization. This is not merely a legal battle, it's a watershed moment for our nation's understanding of justice and equality. One senior Democratic aide remarked, "We must ensure that the process remains fair, not simply an instrument of political retribution." Despite such measured statements, the media narrative continued to spotlight the growing divide, intensifying scrutiny on the judiciary's internal dynamics. Thousands of posts condemning Judge Hargrove's punitive actions, while rallying support for Karoline's bold stand. Tweets, Facebook statuses, and viral video clips replayed every moment, from the judge's public humiliation of Karoline to her passionate declaration of her constitutional rights, fueling a digital storm that left little doubt about where public sentiment lay. Observers noted that this digital uproar was not merely about a legal breach, but a collective cry against perceived elitism and institutional discrimination. Ordinary citizens, legal experts, and political commentators alike weighed in, their voices converging into a resonant demand for systemic accountability. The ripple effects were felt throughout elite circles as well. Within numerous federal courthouses, many judicial staffers quietly expressed relief at distancing themselves from Judge Hargrove. Senior members of the legal community issued subtle statements, reaffirming their commitment to impartiality and reserving judgment until all evidence was evaluated fairly. In private discussions, several influential figures in the law warned that if the scandal persisted, it could lead not only to severe disciplinary action against Hargrove, but potentially to sweeping reforms in how courts manage expressions of personal faith in official proceedings. As the lawsuit's momentum built, every layer of American public life seemed to be compelled to respond. High-ranking political figures, media moguls, and even cultural influencers remarked on the significance of a legal system that was held accountable in the face of unchecked authority. For many, Karoline Leavitt's courageous decision to challenge the system had evolved into a symbol of broader resistance against practices that smother individual rights under the guise of neutrality. The case was fast becoming a national, even global focal point, the embodiment of a paradigm shift, where even those long considered untouchable were not immune from scrutiny or responsibility. In boardrooms and legislative halls across the country, the debate raged. Was this lawsuit a necessary corrective measure against the tyranny of an overzealous judicial mandate, or a political spark destined to ignite further discord. One thing was unequivocally clear. The powerful institutions that once commanded unwavering deference now found themselves scrambling to realign with public sentiment. The ensuing panic among the elites signaled a seismic shift, one that promised to redefine the boundaries of authority, free expression, and the right to personal belief. In the wake of Karoline Leavitt's stunning press conference and the overwhelming public outcry, the foundations of Judge Charles Hargrove's authority began to crack. Whispers of discontent and anxiety permeated the halls of the county courthouse throughout Washington, D.C., where the very individuals responsible for upholding the law now found themselves questioning the integrity of a man who had once seemed beyond reproach. It wasn't long before internal voices in the judicial system decided that silence was no longer an option. Rumors that had swirled around Judge Hargrove's earlier controversial ruling resurfaced with a vengeance. Anonymous memos circulated among his peers, and senior administrative officials hinted that this was not an isolated incident. Investigative journalists soon uncovered a series of overlooked complaints filed by attorneys and litigants throughout his career. Accounts that depicted instances of excessive rigidity, unprofessional outbursts, and even personal bias. One report detailed a similar occurrence, a case where a local social services advocate was reprimanded and fined for wearing a symbol of her cultural heritage during a public hearing. These discoveries painted a picture of a man not only prone to harsh interpretations of neutrality, but also one who had repeatedly allowed his personal prejudices to influence his courtroom decisions. Within the courthouse, conversations turned frantic. Senior judges and clerks held discreet meetings late into the night, their voices hushed but tinged with urgency. We can no longer allow Judge Hargrove's behavior to undermine public confidence in our legal system. One high-ranking clerk confided to a colleague. Others, sharing similar concerns, lamented that his judgments had increasingly appeared influenced by political and personal bias. As word spread, a formal internal investigation was swiftly initiated by the county's Judicial Oversight Committee, tasked with examining every facet of his conduct over the past several years. The investigation magnified the pressure on Hargrove even further. High-profile legal organizations issued statements calling for transparency and accountability, while prominent members of the Bar Association began to question whether his continued presence on the bench was more than a liability to the judicial system. The controversy was no longer confined to press conferences or televised debates. It had become an institutional crisis. Political repercussions quickly followed. The governor of the state, previously cautious in his dealings with the judiciary, started to hint publicly about the possibility of removing Judge Hargrove from his post if deemed necessary. In a carefully worded statement at a press briefing, the governor remarked, "Our commitment to upholding justice and protecting the rights of our citizens must come first. When an authority figure behaves in a way that compromises those values, it is our duty to respond decisively." This statement sent ripples through both political circles and the broader legal community. While some Republican leaders rallied behind Karoline Leavitt, lauding her bold stand for religious freedom and fairness, many Democrats expressed cautious support, emphasizing the need for due process, while acknowledging that unchecked judicial power endangered democratic norms. Inside the courthouse, the fallout was swift and palpable. Judge Hargrove, once a figure of imposing certainty, was now seen more as an embattled relic, whose earlier actions had finally caught up with him. His colleagues began to distance themselves, quietly transferring cases and limiting their interactions with him. In closed-door meetings, several judges expressed relief at the prospect of a sweeping internal review that could finally restore public trust in the judicial branch. Backstage, lawyers and administrative staff exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the reckoning set in motion might signal a seismic shift in how the courts handled allegations of bias and misconduct. As the investigation gained momentum, relentless inquiries from respected news outlets drove further revelations into the public domain. Leaked documents revealed even more instances where Hargrove had seemingly imposed fines or warnings that appeared arbitrary, Social media campaigns began to emerge under slogans such as "Justice for All" and "No More Bias," demanding not only the removal of an evidently flawed judge, but broader reforms within the judicial system to prevent future abuses of power. In one particularly damning expose, aired on primetime television, a montage of past rulings was juxtaposed with testimonies from former litigants who described experiencing humiliation and financial ruin because of Hargrove's uncompromising decisions. The portrayal was stark, making it abundantly clear that the fallout from his rulings had real, devastating consequences for ordinary citizens. The revelation that a judge entrusted to enforce justice could contribute to such a climate of intimidation sent shockwaves through the legal establishment and the public alike. Now, with mounting evidence and political pressure building to an almost intolerable peak, Judge Charles Hargrove seemed to be teetering on the brink. His once proud and unwavering posture had given way to a guarded, almost deflated demeanor. Every appearance he made in court was met with furtive looks, and the internal investigation cast a long, dark shadow over the remainder of his career. It was evident that the era of unchecked judicial presumption was coming to an end, and with it, the striking and ultimately unsustainable titan that was Judge Hargrove. In the tumultuous aftermath of Judge Hargrove's unraveling, the pressure on the judicial establishment intensified to a fever pitch. What had begun as damning revelations and internal accusations now escalated into a full-blown scandal that threatened not only the credibility of the county's court system, but the very foundation of public confidence in justice itself. In the days that followed the explosive exposés and mounting political pressure, an eerie silence began to fall over the courthouse, a silence that would soon give way to a mystery that left everyone questioning the fate of the embattled judge. It was scheduled that morning, less than a week after Judge Hargrove's internal investigation was launched, that the next hearing in the high-profile case would reconvene. Reporters, lawyers, and eager spectators filed back into the courtroom, smartphones at the ready, still reeling from the latest revelations of bias and misconduct that had rocked the system. Yet as the clock struck the appointed hour, an unsettling realization gripped everyone in attendance. Judge Hargrove was nowhere to be seen. At first, a hushed murmur of confusion rippled through the gallery. Court clerks shuffled nervously, checking their dockets and whispering recollections of the judge's meticulously maintained attendance record. The absence was unprecedented. Always known for his punctuality and commanding presence, Judge Hargrove's sudden non-appearance cast a long shadow of uncertainty. It wasn't long before his defense attorney, a normally unflappable man renowned for quick retorts and damage control, took the podium to address the growing unrest. "With deep regret, we must inform the court that Judge Hargrove is unable to attend today's proceedings," the attorney announced in a measured tone that belied the palpable tension in the room. "He has taken a temporary leave of absence due to health concerns." The statement, delivered as an impromptu explanation, earned skeptical glances from many in the audience and among the press. Whispers began to ripple again. Questions about the timing and credibility of the health reasons floated amid furtive looks exchanged between observers. Outside the courtroom, within moments of the announcement, investigative journalists and veteran legal reporters began to probe further. Sources within the judicial system hinted at an anxiety-laden atmosphere where colleagues had grown increasingly uneasy with Judge Hargrove's mounting troubles. Locked-away emails and confidential memos had already begun to surface, recounting a series of questionable decisions and hinting at an overarching pattern of bias. Now the judge's sudden absence added another layer of intrigue to a scandal already spiraling out of control. Over the next few hours, as the courthouse corridors buzzed with theories and speculation, independent media teams launched round-the-clock investigations. It wasn't long before their efforts unearthed a series of startling discoveries. Security camera footage from the courthouse parking lot, dated just hours before the hearing, revealed something unexpected. An unidentified man in a dark suit was seen entering a private terminal area. The grainy video was quickly enhanced by tech-savvy citizens online, and it soon became unmistakably clear that the individual captured on film resembled Judge Hargrove. In multiple short clips, the man could be seen making his way toward a sleek black private jet parked discreetly on a remote tarmac behind the courthouse. Within that same period, additional surveillance footage from a nearby highway toll station added to the suspense. The footage clearly showed a vehicle, an unassuming, heavily tinted sedan, registered under a pseudonymous entity, pulling away from the courthouse compound under the cover of twilight. The sedan's license plate had been obscured deliberately, raising concerns that preparatory measures for a covert departure were underway. Social media channels lit up with posts. Speculation ran rampant. Was the sudden announcement of health issues simply a convenient cover for something far more sinister? As reporters pressed for interviews with court insiders, some officials admitted under condition of anonymity that Judge Hargrove had expressed deep personal concerns in recent days. However, nothing anyone said could contradict the mounting digital evidence that pointed to his deliberate disappearance. The scenario that began to emerge was chilling in its implications. After enduring relentless scrutiny, internal investigations, and widespread condemnation, Judge Hargrove had opted to vanish from public view. And as the evidence soon indicated, from the country altogether. A breaking news bulletin flashed across every major network. Judge Hargrove, missing. Evidence suggests flight from courtroom scandal. The graphic in the bulletin showed the still from the surveillance video, with the judge's silhouette boarding a private jet. Social media, now ablaze with the scandal, questioned whether this was an act of cowardice or an orchestrated escape to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. Political figures joined the conversation, with Republican commentators decrying the perceived flight from accountability of the judiciary, while some centrist voices urged caution, insisting that the complete facts had yet to be verified by an impartial investigation. In the following days, the narrative evolved into a saga of a vanishing figure, a man of the law who had once presided over justice and order, now curiously absent, as if fleeing from the very principles he was tasked with upholding. News outlets ran endless loops of the now infamous surveillance footage, and analysts debated the true implications. Not only had Judge Hargrove rendered himself unavailable for the next scheduled hearing, but his disappearance suggested that no authority, not even that of the judiciary, was impervious to the consequences when the truth began to unravel. Inside the courts and among legal associations, calls for a formal inquiry intensified. Some senior judges, shaking off their earlier reticence, openly stated that Hargrove's actions had undermined confidence in the system, and that measures needed to be taken to preserve the sanctity of the judiciary. Yet amidst the professional outrage and the surging calls for accountability, the absence of Judge Hargrove left a lingering void, a symbol of a power structure in crisis and of a once mighty institution now forced to reckon with its internal failings. By the time the day ended, the story had transformed from a scandal about a fine in a courtroom to a national symbol of institutional flight. Judge Hargrove's last known act, boarding a private jet bound for destinations unknown, became a potent image of a fallen authority seeking refuge beyond the reach of a system it had once dominated. For many, his disappearance was not just a personal retreat. It was emblematic of the lengths to which those who abuse power will go to evade responsibility. In the days following Judge Hargrove's shocking disappearance, an almost surreal collective breath seemed to be held across the nation, a mixture of confusion, indignation, and disbelief that a man sworn to uphold the law could vanish under such enigmatic circumstances. Americans from every walk of life found themselves glued to their televisions and smartphones, witnessing a saga that had transformed from a courtroom scandal into a full-blown national crisis. News bulletins repeatedly flashed the startling headline, "Judge Hargrove flees, vanishes from justice." Social media exploded with real-time updates, and citizens began questioning the very foundation of their judicial system. For many, the once august image of a man of the law had been reduced to that of a fugitive evading accountability, a symbol of a compromised system where even those in power are not above reproach. Across the country, Living rooms, cafes, and office break rooms buzzed with conversations heated with emotion. On one side, outraged citizens decried the scandal as yet another demonstration that no one, regardless of their stature, was immune from the consequences of unethical behavior. In countless posts and tweets, tagged with fervent hashtags, people expressed their dismay at watching a figure who had been entrusted with dispensing justice simply vanish as if his position granted him the right to escape responsibility. How can a judge, the very embodiment of the law, run away like a common criminal? Became a refrain on many digital platforms, resonating deeply with those who had perhaps long harbored concerns about unchecked judicial misconduct. Television news anchors, once preoccupied only with political squabbles and economic forecasts, now devoted significant airtime to the fallout of Judge Hargrove's disappearance. Analysts on live panels debated whether this remarkable twist was an act of cowardice, an orchestrated attempt to circumvent the consequences of his own misdeeds, or the final collapse of a system that had allowed power to shield its missteps for far too long. Throughout news cycles, pundits cited historical parallels where high-ranking officials had faced similar reckonings, emphasizing that in a society governed by the rule of law, no one should be allowed to simply vanish when the weight of evidence bears down upon them. Within government circles, and among policymakers, an undercurrent of urgency began to take shape. In closed-door meetings and impassioned sessions on Capitol Hill, senators and representatives from both sides of the aisle acknowledged that the scandal was more than a personal failing by one judge. It was a clarion call for a comprehensive review of judicial oversight and accountability. Some Republican leaders hailed the audacity of Karoline Leavitt's lawsuit, interpreting it as a corrective measure that would reinvigorate the concept of equal justice. This isn't about partisan infighting, one prominent lawmaker asserted in an interview. It's about ensuring that no individual, regardless of their tenure or public stature, is allowed to undermine our democracy with unchecked bias. Today we see a man fleeing like any other person facing the consequences of his actions, and that must never be tolerated. Simultaneously, several Democratic figures weighed in, cautioning that while accountability was crucial, the system must still preserve the integrity of due process. Let this matter be investigated thoroughly, a leading Democratic senator urged. The facts must emerge clearly so that reforms are enacted, not in haste, but in a manner that restores faith in our judicial institutions. Even as voices across the political spectrum diverged on the approaches to reform, there was a unanimous acknowledgement that the system's credibility had been severely shaken. Amid the maelstrom, Karoline Leavitt emerged as the steadfast emblem of resistance and integrity. Standing amid a chaotic media frenzy outside a hastily convened courthouse press area, she addressed the nation with measured clarity and unyielding resolve. With the backdrop of flashing cameras and the murmur of an expectant crowd, Karoline's voice rang out, "We will not allow the system to hide its mistakes. The law must be equal for all, not just for those whose power or influence shields them from accountability." Today, when a judge flees the very institution he was meant to embody, we are reminded that no one is above the words we hold sacred: justice, fairness, and truth. Her statement, succinct yet potent, cut through the cacophony of partisan debates and served as a rallying cry for reform. It fortified the growing chorus of voices demanding that every official, from the halls of Congress to the bench of justice, be held to the same immutable standard. Her words inspired many to take to the streets in peaceful protests, to write op-eds, and to call for legislative reviews aimed at ensuring that judicial independence did not translate into impunity. In cafes and living rooms nationwide, ordinary citizens found themselves debating the next steps for their system of justice. Social media forums turned into virtual town squares where legal scholars, activists, and everyday individuals exchanged ideas, presented evidence, and called for new legislation that would mandate greater transparency and oversight of the courts. Experts weighed in on televised segments and online webinars, discussing reforms that could prevent such a crisis from recurring, from instituting independent review panels to enforcing stricter ethics guidelines for judges. The national conversation also delved into the symbolic resonance of Judge Hargrove's flight. For some, it was a cautionary tale, an unmistakable indicator that when institutions falter, the public must rise to hold them accountable. For others, it represented a turning point, a moment that may very well catalyze sweeping changes in how judicial conduct is monitored and enforced. In editorials and think pieces published in leading newspapers, commentators wrote that this scandal might pave the way for a new era in American jurisprudence, one where the scales of justice are balanced more fairly, ensuring that power and privilege can no longer serve as shields against scrutiny. The reaction of society was not limited to fierce debates and impassioned statements. It was also punctuated by moments of personal reflection. Many Americans, inspired by Karoline's unwavering stand, began to examine the ways in which their own voices had often been stifled by institutions that claimed unassailable authority. The scandal in all its complexity thus became a mirror for the nation, a mirror reflecting both its enduring commitment to freedom and the areas where this freedom stood imperiled. Even as the legal and political battles raged on, there was a palpable sense of hope among the public. Hope that justice, though delayed and battered, would ultimately prevail over corruption and bias. And as Karoline's lawsuit advanced rapidly through the courts, a process now accelerated by the public's demand for swift accountability, the sentiment was clear. The day had come when the truth, in all its raw fidelity, would force even the mightiest of figures to answer for their actions. As the national uproar simmered and the dust of scandal began to settle, the story of Judge Charles Hargrove's abrupt vanishing evolved into something far greater than a mere personal flight. It became a watershed moment, a symbol of a system finally coming under the unforgiving scrutiny of the public it was meant to serve. In courtrooms across the nation, and in homes, offices, and cafes, citizens debated the meaning of his disappearance. Was it the cowardly escape of a man who had abused his power, or a clear signal that the era of impunity for even the most influential figures was drawing to a close? The collective voice that emerged was unequivocal. No one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. In Washington, the fallout from Judge Hargrove's departure rippled through the highest echelons of power. The sweeping internal investigations, combined with mounting evidence of his repeated biases, forced a long-overdue reckoning within the judicial system. Lawmakers and senior administrators, previously reluctant to challenge the prestige of the bench, now faced clamoring demands for reform. Across the political spectrum, leaders from both sides called for a renewed emphasis on transparency, ethics, and the protection of personal freedoms in legal proceedings. In legislative chambers, proposals for comprehensive judicial oversight were introduced, promising that the case of Judge Hargrove would be the catalyst for deep institutional introspection. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt, whose resolute stand had sparked this unprecedented movement, emerged as a national emblem for justice and liberty. In the weeks following the scandal, her lawsuit against the judge and the judicial system accelerated through the courts with record speed. Every media outlet, from mainstream television networks to digital platforms, carried her message as a clarion call for citizen empowerment. In one final, highly anticipated televised press conference, Karoline addressed the nation with a calm assurance that belied the turbulence of recent events. Standing before a backdrop of American flags and the stately columns of a restored courthouse, she spoke in a measured tone that resonated deeply. Today our nation witnesses that accountability is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is the sacred destiny of every institution entrusted with the law. Judge Hargrove's disappearance is not merely a story of one man's flight. It's a profound affirmation that no one can hide when their actions betray the values upon which our democracy is built. The principles of justice, fairness, and religious freedom must be upheld without exception, and today we take a decisive stand to ensure that every voice is respected and every wrong is addressed. Her words, broadcast live and shared millions of times across social media, crystallized the movement. In a remarkable display of public unity, citizens from every background, religious activists, legal scholars, political reformers, and everyday Americans joined in demanding that the judicial system be reformed and that those who wield authority be held to standards of transparency and fairness. The slogan "Truth over Power" became a rallying cry, a mantra that encapsulated the collective belief that the rule of law must always prevail over the arrogance of unchecked authority. As the legal proceedings continued with an urgency that had never before been seen, another element of transformation emerged. Judge Hargrove's dramatic exit, captured by surveillance cameras as his silhouette vanished into the night aboard a private jet, became an indelible image, a photograph etched into the national conscience. Editorial cartoons, viral memes, and impassioned blog posts depicted the fallen judge not as a heroic arbiter of justice, but as a symbol of systemic failure. His escape, widely interpreted as a desperate bid to avoid the consequences of his actions, served as an enduring reminder that the mechanisms of accountability, once activated by public demand, could uproot even the most venerable institutions. In academic forums and televised debates, experts argued that the scandal represented a turning point in American jurisprudence. They posited that the case would inevitably lead to sweeping changes in how judicial conduct was monitored, with proposals for independent oversight panels and stringent ethics codes gaining momentum. Legal critics emphasized that the fundamental right to express one's beliefs freely and to do so without fear of censorship by an arbitrarily biased system had been defended in no small measure by Karoline's fearless stand. For Karoline Leavitt herself, the personal cost of her battle had been steep, yet she remained unfaltering, her resolve hardened by the knowledge that her courage had sparked an essential fight for equality. In subsequent interviews, she recalled the painful moments of public humiliation and the overwhelming pressure of standing up against a powerful system. "I never intended to incite chaos," she said softly. "I only wish to remind everyone that the right to live our truth is inviolable. When the law turns its back on that truth, we must have the courage to reclaim it, no matter the cost." One evening, as the sun dipped behind the domed Capitol, Karoline stood before a modest gathering of community leaders and legal advocates. With quiet conviction, she read from her personal journal, a document that chronicled not just the public battle, but the intimate reflections of a woman determined to forge justice from adversity. "Our struggle," she declared, "is not against a person, but against the idea that power can be shielded from its own misdeeds. Every time a judge, a politician, or any man or woman of authority dismisses the rights of the people, they risk becoming the very enemy of the freedom they are supposed to protect." Her words echoed in the twilight, as if casting a hopeful light on a future where even the mighty would be held to account. In the final analysis, the scandal that erupted in that fateful courthouse did more than shatter the illusion of invulnerability. It redefined the moral fabric of a nation. Karoline Leavitt's battle became a testament to the enduring truth that no one is above the law, and that the strength of a society lies in its ability to confront and correct its own injustices. Her legacy, and the legacy of those who dared to demand accountability, would be remembered as a turning point in the relentless quest for justice and freedom. Subscribe if you believe that when the powerful tremble under the weight of truth, society itself is transformed, and that every act of courage in the face of injustice paves the way for a fairer, more accountable world.